Hey everyone. So if you haven't watched the actual discussion about integral theory and specifically about how states of consciousness work according to Wilber's model, go back and fucking watch that. Because all the questions here are going to be discussions about that. At the beginning of that playlist, there also will be an introduction video. I would watch that first just to get a very bare bones thing. Please understand we're covering a lot of ground really fucking quickly. My lovely partner is going to be going through and reading your guys' questions to me. We're going to try to go through them as quickly as possible. We've got other shit to do. So let's get into it. What is the first question, my kisses?
All right, so we've got Sin. So, does empathy fall... Things were falling on the desk. It's okay. So, does empathy...
Gross phenomenon.
Right? Does empathy fall into dream logic or subtle as well?
So, subtle and dream logic are kind of part of the same area. However, what I would say is that empathy is a really interesting one because there appears to be multiple layers of reality with that one. So we haven't covered this yet, but in the integral model, right, there appears to be ways in which there are multiple truths within reality. So yeah, empathy is a really good way to describe that. We'll talk about this more in the quadrants video, but essentially there is the psychological, emotional experience of empathy, right? That appears to be a feeling or an intuition, perhaps. That falls into an interesting middle ground. There's the physiological aspect of it, where we can talk about mirror neurons and the ability to be empathetic. We can talk about the we space. We can talk about intersubjective interaction. That is, does this person have empathy for you? Are they capable of understanding the place you're coming from, the world where you're at? And so in the case of states, what I would say is that states of being can improve empathy. That is, if you suddenly feel fucking one with everything, there's no you, there's just isness, oneness, suchness, whatever fucking term you want to use for it. Spoiler, you're gonna probably be a lot more empathetic to the people around you. You don't feel a separation from them. In fact, I would argue that lack of empathy, hatred, bigotry, all come from a perceived false separation from the other. Right? Like, there's a way in which you not only separate yourself from them, but then you also even try to make them different than, right? They're the enemy, the bad guy, right? There's something different than. In some cases, they're not even human to you. There are people that watch this channel just to hate watch me and literally want me dead because they don't see me as a human being, or I guess I'm a threat to Western civilization, which is POG. So I hope that makes sense. What's the next question?
Tiamat, how can a causal state be distinguished from dissociation? That's actually a really good one.
It's a really fantastic question. Tiamat asks the real questions. So this gets a little dodgy because we're getting into things that have a really hard time having languaging. But basically my argument would be is that causal states of being, there is no self to dissociate. What I mean by that is, to dissociate, there's a you in panic or going through some sort of trauma reaction, right? Some sort of flashback. And then a reaction to that, whatever that phenomenon is, reacting as though you're back at that trauma or having some sort of panic attack. And then what inevitably ends up happening is that as your way to cope and deal with that is to dissociate, to separate. The problem is there's still a self. The self is still engaging there. It's just numbed the fuck out or just completely left the building, but it's still there. It's just not engaging with shit. Or it's numbed itself out so much that it doesn't really engage. What I would say is that if there's that feeling or that experience of dissociating that isn't causal, because that's still a phenomenon, that's still experience. That's still you experiencing a thingy. If that makes sense. What's the next question?
We've got Lucy. How... I scrolled in the middle of me reading.
Sorry, my bad.
How does boredom/depression fit into a causal state?
So again, depression, we can get into quadrant discussions. So there's depression at the clinical level. So, brain states, differences of serotonin, dopamine, shit like that. We can talk about, again, boredom is also lack of dopamine, right? Lack of enjoyment or lack of interaction. And from a causal perspective, Again, there's no you and there's no boredom. I know that seems like it's a cheap way to answer it, but in some ways, if you're experiencing the depression, there's a you to experience it. So you're not really experiencing a state of causal, a causal state, so to speak. I'm very, very sorry that the emotes are not to your liking. Nothing I can do about that. This is the most we can have right now. So we got next question is Tiamat.
Tiamat, subsequently, if the self does not exist in the state of causal and all things pass through, could it be considered a kind of flow state, or is there not even anything to be passed through?
So I would say that it's not that the self doesn't exist. That's partial accuracy. I would actually say what it is that the self is deconstructed or seen through would be another way to say it. You step back far enough and you suddenly realize that all of this is just coming up and falling away again and again and again. So my take would be is that what a flow state is a little bit different.
Yeah, I was going to say, we should probably talk about what a flow state is.
So I'm going to do a very short version of this. But what a flow state essentially is there's that moment where you're doing something. Maybe you're putting together a model. Maybe you're working at Burger King. Maybe you're just sitting there jerking it. I don't know. But all of a sudden there's that moment of bliss where you're like, everything clicks and you're just fucking doing it. It's whatever it is, you're doing it. You can have this at work. You can have this while meditating. You can have this while jerking off. It's just suddenly an awareness of everything in you is in flow together. Everything of you is I would almost say in some ways it's much closer to witness consciousness, though not quite as far. But essentially it's that you just enter a place where there's just pure equilibrium. There's just you and the thing you're doing. There's no thought about it. There's no judgments about it. There's no like wondering, did dad love me? There's no any kind of nonsense like that. It's just that experience. Wouldn't that still apply then with a flow state of perception rather than active action? Generally speaking, I don't ever hear the term flow state as just a thing of perception. I would actually say that usually flow states happen when the self is engaged in a particular thing and feels, I don't want to say unified because that's a little dodgy, but like basically unified with its environment and what it's doing. I wouldn't say that falls into the same category as causal, because even with causal, everything falls away and there's just radical darkness. Unless you like literally suddenly fall into shunyata emptiness when you're putting together food at Burger King. Which I guess you could, but I don't even know how you'd do it. You'd be on the ground drooling. Right? So we can cover flow states more in a future discussion, probably not related to integral. By the way, do not go into causal states when you're at work at Burger King. Falling asleep and letting your head hit the grill is not the way to do that. And definitely going into all emptiness, because as much as you don't give a fuck about your face burning, other people might. This has been your safety message.
All right. So from Clueless, I don't dream, or at least don't remember them at all. And how could dreaming relate to a causal state if we're relating a causal state to sleep? Do you want me to pause there, or do you want me to keep reading?
Yeah, keep reading.
Also, how does not dreaming or not remembering dreams work in the first place? I've always thought it quite strange that my brain just doesn't feel like doing that.
So Clueless, I found for years that I had a similar thing. I only generally remember my dreams for the longest time unless something really important happened in them. Other times it was just emptiness, just fucking turned off. As I've gotten older, I've noticed I've remembered more of them, but some people just don't. They just don't remember their dreams very well. And some of that could be different factors in your health and your environment. That could be issues by which, if you're a very deep sleeper, then you might just not have any cognition of what's happening. But I'm pretty sure if we hooked you up, we could see easily that you're probably going through REM sleep. Like your brain is still going through those states. But the lack of remembering, I mean, there's a lot of things that go into that, including working memory and a lot of association and it's complicated, but basically, long story short, is your mind then tends to hold on to things depending on their importance and depending on their meaning to you. If your dreams are just you just kind of choking up random nonsense about your day, like you're sitting there and rebuilding yourself made of Legos, for example, guess what? You're probably not going to remember it much, unless you really like Legos, I guess. Right? So, and as far as the question about, and how could dreaming relate to causal sleep? So dreaming doesn't. If you actually want to make a nice physiological correlate, dreaming is more connected to subtle. Again, dreamlike phenomenon happens in subtle states. And again, dreaming or energetics or whatever thing, shamanism, all that seems to go under a dream logic type thing. So that's what's happening there. That's one part of sleep. I would say that's REM sleep. Deep dreamless sleep would be causal. You actually do both of these at night. You go through the cycle from near awake, REM, deep dreamless, I think REM again, memory serves, kind of in that in-between state, back again. And this goes in cycles. I believe each cycle is an hour and a half to 2 hours, give or fucking take. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that happens in sleep, which I'm not covering here because that gets real complicated real quick. What's the next one?
Got Minerva. Is subtle consciousness the area where you start seeing sensations bubble up?
I would say it kind of goes in between. Obviously, sensation seems to come about from physiological phenomenon. Your interpretation of such is thus the subtle phenomenon, right? So if I experience butterflies in my stomach, right, the weird indigestion, nausea you get when you're kind of making out with someone you like for the first time or whatnot, that's the gross phenomenon. That's the physiological phenomenon. Though even arguably the interpretation there is still interpretive, so that gets dodgy. But essentially it's a gross phenomenon being interpreted by the body, and then it spits out meaning to you, and then you interpret that as that is. Maybe you feel super nervous, maybe you feel super excited. There you go.
All right, so from Lucy, where/how do sedatives come into play? Where you wake up and it just feels like a blank.
So where I would say that comes into play is that if we're talking about unconsciousness, unconsciousness is that one I'm not as familiar with, so I'll say this. Either it's probably a way in which you're just sort of forced to go to deep dreamless sleep in which you've skipped REM. This is why people can wake up feeling like shit when they've been like drugged or knocked out. Or you're going into a state of unconsciousness where it's not even that there's an absence of self, it's just that there's black. Like the brain is off essentially. Like not off, but you know what I mean. Essentially what's happening is you're not fully in, there's not really a you there. This is why people who wake up after they've been drugged or whatnot, it doesn't feel like they've had deep dreamless sleep or feel rested. They feel weird. They feel off, like time has been stolen from them. That feels more real to me, more in that vein than something like that. So.
All right. So from Sin, is it possible that non-dual also refers to higher self and lower self distinction?
Sin, I don't know what you mean by that. I mean, it depends on the school, but I would say that if you're coming from a non-dual state, and again, non-dual state's really descriptive and not particularly like true, but in the sense that if you are somebody who is, if you are experiencing or one with everything, you're feeling that experience of suchness through meditation and Zen or oneness with God or whatever the fuck, there's not really, I mean, the self exists, and theoretically the higher and lower self distinctions, depending on which school of thought you're talking about, do also still exist, but they're all still part of the same thing. The thing that's interesting about non-dual is all of the things exist, but none of them are separate. If you want to see a good example of this, I can't show it here for copyright, but after this stream, go look up the blanket scene from I Heart Huckabees. That is what we are pointing at. The blanket scene from I Heart Huckabees. Next question. By the way, real quick, sorry. By the way, we want to get through this, so I'm calling it on questions. No more questions after this. Lucid dreaming would just be in subtle states and being able to manipulate them. Look, I can fly. It's just you having control over the dream logic. Go on.
So from Tiamat, is this emptiness better characterized as becoming more aware of the self or less aware of the self?
I would say if you want to use that discrepancy, I would say sort of like more aware of the sense of the self's fundamental limitations. That, like, in a sense, your ego or your sense of self is basically a construct that we're engaging with based on your thoughts, feelings, preferences, memories, etc. And all of those things together sort of give you an informed variation of who you are or what's going on. And if you're very identified with that sense of self, then anything bad or good that happens to it, you're probably going to be identified. You need to do those in the links on stream. If that's not working, I can have Zena turn it back on after this.
Yeah, I don't have it on right now. Sorry.
Yeah, we can do it after this, guys. That's fine.
If you post it in general too, a mod can post for us, but otherwise I just didn't get a chance to turn it on today.
Then this next one?
Also from Tiamat. Stop scrolling.
Sorry.
Does this make non-duality a perception of the underlying unity behind systems, or the unity that systems form into, or is that a functionality meaningless order of causality?
So what I would say is, and this is the term I'm going to steal from a good friend of mine that I don't talk too much these days, sadly, is within the context of a non-dual experience, you notice the chaotic nature of all things. That is, it is neither chaos nor order, but is both chaos and order. It is chaos with its own sense of order within it. Again, when we're talking about non-dual, discrete, separate, or duality kind of terms don't really work. You're kind of SOL as far as descriptions. Wilbur described it as isness or suchness. Yes, you can post. Go ahead and take anything from General 2 and put it in the links upstream.
Minerva, what is going on at the intersection of states and stages specifically? Or is stages of consciousness a different video?
So stages of consciousness or states of being are this video. If we're talking about levels, right, I'll use that language to kind of differentiate these. Stages is also used, but it gets fucking weird. So, like, levels of development factor into this and lines factor into this because, again, remember like earlier I talked about the idea of radical empathy, like suddenly having a spiritual experience? Somebody who's, say, like a serial killer who has, you know, maybe is brilliant. Maybe they have a very high conventional IQ or maybe even a post-conventional view of things, but coming from a moral stance, their moral development is like garbage. Like, they have a state experience. It's going to be color-coded by the interaction of these developmental lines, if that makes any sense. They're going to have a very, very different view of Jesus than, say, evangelical Christian will. And we will be going over levels of development in the near future, so look for that. All right, we're going to go over the last two, folks.
So Zafre Fanek. Considering that human consciousness is built upon the consciousness of our animal predecessors, why do you think the adaptation of experiencing these states emerged? Is it part of a higher order of thinking, a byproduct, or us being able to observe our higher order processes from a more basal system of awareness?
Yes. Like, in some ways, I don't know, because that's a big complicated question about consciousness, right? We don't know where this comes from. Now, I will state altered states are capable in animals. Elephants, for example, will get their asses drunk and then just destroy a town. That's a thing they do. Dolphins will bump into fucking pufferfish to get as high as fuck. Technically, those are exogenous states. They're inducing a state. It's just not really a great benefit, I guess. Well, I guess they're high or drunk, but whatever. So what I would say with this is that in order to sort of differentiate, are animals capable of this stuff? Now, I would argue, one, do they pass the mirror test? Is there an awareness or a sense of self there that they are engaging with? Is there a way for us to know that? Is there language or some other way or some other method to communicate? I mean, even Coco's abilities to communicate were grossly over exaggerated in some ways. So it's really hard to know with animals. And it's not to say they can't. I just don't know if there's even enough of an ego to differentiate if they can. Right? Like, that's the best I got. I'm not a zoologist. I'm certainly not a fucking veterinarian. So, last one.
I'm gonna try and pronounce this. Verona?
I always call her very Rona, but she doesn't yell at me about it, so it's fine.
All right, well, we'll go with that. Talking about sleep, dreams, dream states, and dream logic. I feel like there's an interesting question to ask considering the fact that animals, e.g. dogs and cats, obviously dream as well, but I don't know how to phrase it.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't see any reason why animals wouldn't have access to these things. Animals dream. Bunny dreams all the time and is barking in her sleep. She's doing these little, like,
right? Yeah.
She's doing something, right? Like she's engaging in some particular way. But to sort of say whether or not that is, there's a way to distinguish that is really hard because there's not a self. There may or may not be a self depending on things. Dogs don't generally pass the mirror test, to my understanding. And then on top of it, there's a lot of other shit there as far as like,
Bunny doesn't.
Are they able to interpret those things, right? Do they have a sense of self enough to be able to go and do interpretive or meaning-making functions? So yeah, animals dream, and I assume mammals go into deep dream of sleep just like we do, but again, differentiating them without that higher order consciousness, fuck if I know. So this was just the question and answer portion for states. In future videos, we are going to talk about levels, lines, quadrants, and types. And then we're going to go into a little bit more complicated stuff in the future. So I know this stuff seems highly theoretical, but I want to give it to you as a map to better understand how I look at things. And again, anyone out there who is familiar with integral, this is not to say that I agree with everything Wilbur says, and this is certainly not to say that I like areas where the integral community went. There's a lot of stupid-ass life coaches that I've argued with numerous times. And their own attacks on postmodernism, I think, have led a lot of people who are into this stuff to get into unintentional interactions with the alt-right. Because when you deny postmodernism and stages of development that involve post-conventional or postmodernism and are trying to go beyond that, a lot of people falter and go backwards. In fact, I can point to somebody if I didn't want to be a bit, if I wanted to, if I didn't want to say something,
a little spicy,
a little bit calling somebody out. But I've known people who are connected to the integral community that are just neo-Nazis now because again, the problem is when you're talking about a map that involves interpretive functioning, spoiler, the person still brings themselves to it. And so if you're, a trans girl who is really postmodern, you take a very different look at the map than say a white guy who's mad at, black people marching. Sorry. So my goal here with the map is to watch out for confirmation bias, and also fuck Nazis. Just saying. Anyway, no, that's a spicy take, but fuck Nazis.
I believe this has been our question and answer. Thank you for coming.
And all right, we'll see you in the next one.
Sounds good.